Good evening. My name is Joshua Sheldon, and I sit before you proudly today in front of my laptop to discuss with you the microplastic toxicology of marine mammals. This is the case study of the East Asian finless porpoise. Let's get right into it. I'm going to share my screen so you can see exactly what I am talking about. I'm going to switch this into the slideshow view. There we go. Here's our cute little buddy, the East Asian finless porpoise. Here's me. I'll be moving my face around so you guys can see me talk as I go. Let's get into it. To keep things organized, I'm dividing this presentation into two halves. We'll talk about microplastics, and then we'll talk about this handsome fellow, the East Asian finless porpoise. Microplastics are extremely small pieces of plastic debris in the environment. They're categorized by size, material, mass, color, shape, and texture. And the most common materials are the ones that you see here listed on the bottom of the screen. These also happen to be the ones that are most relevant to our study. These include things like, give me a moment, polyamides or nylons, polyester, polycarbonate, polyethylene, polyethylene terephthalate. This one sucks. All my homies hate this one. Polystyrene, styrofoam, another stinker, real bad piece of plastic. And we got polypropylene, another very bad one. Now, we've been judging these microplastics based on their size, and I think that's unfair. That was loud. We've been judging these microplastics based on their size. I think that's a little unfair. They could have a very nice personality. We have yet to find out. As it turns out, microplastics in the body do not have a very nice personality. They can cause a lot of negative health effects. And these include physical blockages, disrupting organ function, chemical poisoning, contamination of breast milk and the placental environment, and they can be a conduit for bacteria and viruses. This is the East Asian finless porpoise, and the study was done by Chinese scientists in 2018 with the Marine Pollution Bulletin. Some background information here on the East Asian finless porpoise. It is a small gray porpoise with no dorsal fin. It is distributed throughout shallow waters of China and Japan above soft sandy seabeds. Its diet consists of fish, shrimp, and small cephalopods, and the IUCN status has it labeled as endangered. The Yellow and Bohai seas are hotspots for microplastic pollution. They have large commercial and recreational fisheries, and this is a large source of that pollution. It is also home to the Dalian and Tianjin ports. These are two of the busiest ports in the world. Tianjin is recessed into the Bohai Bay, while Dalian is at the mouth of the Bohai Sea. Shipping traffic is very heavy through this area. Let's get into the methods of this study. Bycatch of 7 specimens were mistakenly caught in commercial fishing. They were transported to the lab on ice, and their intestines were removed and washed through sieves of 100 and 125 microns. That's like really small. The foreign objects were counted and sorted. We're going to go through a lot of data, so I'll try to keep it simple and focused. Fibers accounted for most of these samples. Everything fell under categories of sheets, fragments, and foams. All pieces fell under these 6 microplastic categories of material that you see here listed on the left of the screen. And various colors were found. I'm going to move this to the bottom. Sure. These photos were taken under a dissection microscope. Photos A and B show microplastic fibers. The light pink and the blue fibers are present there. Photos C and D show transparent fragments, and photos A, E, and F show polystyrene foam. Figure 2 shows graphs of the pieces per individual. The distance in meters is also labeled on the intestinal tract on the x-axis. There's a whole lot of info to unpack here, so we'll save the smaller details and skip to the main idea, which is that most of the microplastic items are fibers, which you see in blue on these tables. And they were found more commonly found, excuse me, they were more commonly found towards the front of the intestines. That's where you'll find the small intestine, which has more folds for absorbing nutrients. So less area for things to slip through, and by extension, more capture of these fibers. Figure 3A shows the microplastics by color and shape. Figure 3B shows the microplastics by material and shape. There's a lot of information to unpack here, but for the sake of time, we will move on. This is where our most important information is going to be. This is a table of the 7 specimens and their age, sex, and other traits, along with the number of pieces of microplastic per individual. The most important factors that you'll see here are age and sex. Some trends can be found in the data. Adult males have the highest average of any subset, that is 26 pieces per individual. Adult females have less due to the process of maternal transfer. Their average is 16.5 pieces. Juveniles have a lower but still significantly high average at 16.3 pieces per individual. These findings are all congruent with scientists' current understandings of microplastic accumulation, which is great. Males have the most and females will have less because of that maternal transfer that I mentioned. That is when the mother transfers contaminants from her own body to the body of the offspring, either through the placental environment or through breast milk. It should be noted that although this data is congruent, it is a tiny sample because there are only 7 specimens. So only through future studies can we determine if this trend is what is occurring throughout the ocean, or if this is just an outlier. It's time to get into discussion. We have some existing data. These are microplastic abundances in the intestinal tracts of other cetaceans. The data is not the most reliable to compare to the East Asian finless porpoise for 2 reasons. Some of these cetaceans are not comparable because they have different lifestyles, such as the humpback whale. We want to compare apples to apples, and comparing a porpoise to a whale isn't really productive in this study. Other data entries only have data coming from one individual cetacean, and they should be considered data deficient, like the Tursiops truncatus or bottlenose dolphin that you see near the bottom. It only has one individual, and we have no idea where that individual sits in a data set. It could also be an outlier. However, of this table, we do have 3 cetaceans that we can compare the East Asian finless porpoise to. Those are the common dolphin, striped dolphin, and the harbor porpoise. And from this data, we find out that cetaceans with similar body shapes, sizes, and feeding habits had higher levels than the East Asian finless porpoise. And to ask why is a very important thing. We don't know why as of yet, but as you can see, all 3 of the cetaceans in red have higher amounts of microplastics per individual. Identifying sources of microplastics is difficult, but certain trends can be used to determine the various origins of the pieces. Plastic fibers tend to come from shipping and fishing. Nylon fibers usually come from manufacturing textiles. Other shapes and materials come from coastal runoff and littering. Microplastic accumulation is how organisms end up having that many contaminants in their body. And maternal transfer is one of the ways that this happens. Maternal transfer is the transfer of contaminants from mother to fetus in utero. Notice how the neonatal porpoise has the highest amount of plastic items among the juveniles. It has 23 pieces of microplastic, while the average of other juveniles is 15 pieces. We move this down. This raises some important questions. Oh gosh, gotta move this back up to the top. It'd be nice if it could just disappear. Okay. This data poses some questions. One is, are all porpoises receiving similar amounts of microplastic from maternal transfer, or is this just an outlier? How quickly are these pieces being lost to egestion? And for reference, egestion is the process by which contaminants are lost from the body of the animal through natural excrement. For example, if there are pieces in the microplastic pieces in the intestine of a cetacean, how quickly are those being lost through the natural excrement of the animal? How long does it take for them to make their way out of the intestines? And while they're in there, how much toxicity are they inflicting upon the animal? Final question, as the porpoises grow, are they mistakenly ingesting more microplastics? Now we get to biomagnification. Biomagnification is a process by which contaminants accumulate in an organism throughout the consumption of prey species. More data on adult porpoises from figure 4, as you can see here in the middle, can show that biomagnification is happening in these adult porpoises. The average adult porpoise has 21.25 pieces per individual, while juveniles have an average of 16.3 pieces. We still don't know how many pieces are being lost to egestion. There is a study of the gray seal and its relationship with Atlantic mackerel. Biomagnification has been demonstrated here, and a predator-prey relationship study can answer more questions. This would be a great one to apply to the East Asian finless porpoise. To design that would be decently simple. Fishermen, volunteer fishermen likely, would have to target a specific species of fish that is known to be a prey item of the East Asian finless porpoise. And then microplastics would have to be counted in both these fish and in specimens of East Asian finless porpoise. Now we move on to the mistaken ingestion of microplastics. This topic is another difficult one to discuss because the data is limited. The data we do have poses lots of questions. Do these porpoises ingest microplastics by mistake? How often does it happen? Is it an accidental occurrence during hunting, or is it intentional but still mistaken? And then, is this behavior only found in juveniles, or do adults mistakenly ingest items too? And how quickly is egestion happening? Let's get to intestinal retention and egestion. I've talked about those very much, and they are very important to this study. Let's move my face out of here. Folds in the intestines are what capture and absorb nutrients during digestion. They are also what the microplastic items get caught in. In the small intestine, there are more folds, and in the large intestine, there are less. Referring back to figure 2, shows us that more fibers are caught in the beginning of the small intestine, and in general, the small intestine held more items. Individual 6 shows only fibers in the first 4 meters of the intestinal tract, and by meter 6, there are almost no fibers left, and it becomes all fragments and sheets. Egestion, like I mentioned before, is the natural excretion of foreign material in the GI tract. We don't know a whole lot about the rate of egestion, although it has been theorized in other organisms that it does happen. There aren't a lot of ways to study it in a controlled environment, and it could be potentially inhumane to study on test subjects with plastics or other non-digestible material. So how will that be studied in the future? We don't know yet. That's up for people to design a study and figure it out. What we can tell from this study is interesting. It seems like we have in a neonatal porpoise 23 microplastic items, which is very high, but as the porpoises get older, it seems that they are having less and less. If that is true among all porpoises, that would strongly indicate that egestion is a part of the process of microplastic elimination in the bodies of these animals. Only more studies, more samples, and more data would be able to tell us whether or not the egestion is happening and how much it is happening. Toxicology of microplastics. This is the most important part of the study. And it's currently unclear what effects microplastics are having in the tissues of cetaceans. Here's what we do know. Large pieces in the water can injure cetaceans in entanglements and abrasions. Buildup of microplastics in the digestive system can cause blockages, and microplastics in the body can potentially leach POPs or persistent organic pollutants into blubber and organs and muscle tissues as well. There is a current study being conducted on the concentration of phthalate ester, which directly correlates to the amount of microplastics that are in the water column. I forgot to mention the Mediterranean fin whales. That's that's who the tissues belong to that the phthalate ester is being tested for. And this study would be excellent to do in the East Asian finless porpoise. All scientists would have to do is get their hands on more specimens, and instead of doing intestines alone, they would also need tissue samples to study those effects. Now it's time to get into future action. This is where all of the, oh my goodness. Okay. Spoiler. Again. Okay. Future action is very important. What we're going to need are more samples of the East Asian finless porpoise for the study of intestinal contents. We're going to need tissue samples to analyze the leaching of POPs for toxicology. And as for pollution management, we need microplastic source tracing to find out where these things come from. We're going to need a large waste management reform in China. Although it's easy to say that, it's not as easy for the Chinese government to make. We need increased public awareness. This is something that can be worked on without support from the government per se. We just need people to know where their trash is going and know that it should not go in storm drains, gutters, and waterways. With that, I thank you so much. The East Asian finless porpoise thanks you as well. And these are my sources. Should be noted that the one here on the bottom is the scientific article that I read that kicked off this whole research project for me. I had a very good time presenting this, and I'm really glad I did it. I kind of just found a rabbit hole and then went into a deeper rabbit hole, and I just kept finding more and more data, and that's why this presentation is so long. But I thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful night.